They call it the Alaska Triangle, a name that seems almost too neat, too small for the endless wilderness it represents. Between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow lies a stretch of land so vast and untamed that even the most seasoned outdoorsmen feel uneasy when flying over it. This is a place where the trees stretch taller than cathedrals, where fog rolls in without warning, and where the silence is so heavy it feels alive. It's a land of haunting beauty and merciless danger, a place that does not forgive carelessness. But the strangest thing about the Alaska Triangle isn't its terrain or its wildlife. It's the people, or rather the people who vanish. Over 20,000 disappearances have been recorded here since the 1970s. Hikers, pilots, tourists, hunters, entire groups of experienced explorers have entered this vast, icy expanse and never come back. No wreckage, no bodies, no tracks. It's as if the land itself swallows them whole. On an October morning in 1998, veteran bush pilot Sam Keller prepared for what should have been one of his easiest flights. He was no stranger to Alaska's rugged skies. With over 15 years of experience and more than 1,000 logged flights, Sam was known for his calm under pressure and his almost uncanny ability to navigate through storms. That day he was scheduled to fly a supply run from Anchorage to a remote mining camp near Nome, 90 minutes in the air. Clear skies, light winds, and a sturdy single-engine Piper Navajo. Nothing out of the ordinary. He drank his usual coffee from the airport cafe, joked with the ground crew, and loaded the last of the cargo himself. Before takeoff, he radioed air traffic control with a smile in his voice. Anchorage Tower, Keller Flight 228 ready for departure. His words would be among the last anyone ever heard from him. At first, everything was textbook. Radar tracked his plane steadily westward as he crossed Cook Inlet. His altitude consistent, his speed normal. He checked in twice, each time sounding composed. Then at 9:47 a.m. his signal flickered. A crackle of static interrupted his voice. Approaching Tanana Valley, and then silence. Air traffic control attempted to re-establish contact, calling his flight number repeatedly, but there was no response. The radar showed his plane continuing for another 20 miles before the signal vanished completely. No distress call, no emergency beacon, nothing. Within hours, the Alaska Search and Rescue Team was mobilized. They sent helicopters, ground units, and tracking dogs into the wilderness. Over 500 square miles of terrain were scoured, from dense spruce forests to ice-capped ridges. The weather held clear for 3 days, a rare gift in Alaska, but even that wasn't enough. Not a single fragment of metal, not a scrap of fabric, not a trace of the plane or its pilot was ever found. It was as if Sam Keller and his aircraft had dissolved into thin air. The official report concluded probable crash due to disorientation, but the investigators couldn't hide their unease. Planes don't simply disappear in calm weather without a trace, especially not ones flown by pilots as skilled as Sam. In Anchorage, his sister Emily was devastated. Sam had always been the rock of the family, the one who brought laughter to every gathering and adventure to every story. He was the kind of man who loved the solitude of the Alaskan sky, who believed the wilderness held a quiet sort of truth. When he vanished, Emily refused to accept the official explanation. She spent weeks calling rescue stations, scanning flight paths, and even interviewing locals who claimed to have seen or heard something unusual that day. Some said they'd seen flashes of light near the mountains, bluish orbs that hovered silently before fading away. Others claimed they heard strange, low humming sounds echoing through the valleys. One old trapper, his face leathery from years in the cold, told her in a grave voice, "Sometimes the land takes what it wants, and when it does, you don't go looking for it." Stories like that weren't new to Alaskans. The indigenous Tlingit and Athabascan peoples had long spoken of places where the spirit world overlapped with the physical, gateways where one could slip between realities and never return. The legend spoke of Kushtaka, shape-shifting beings who lured travelers to their deaths by imitating the voices of loved ones. There were also tales of lights in the sky, unseen forces in the earth, magnetic distortions that made compasses spin like toys. Scientists dismissed these as folklore, but the pilots who flew over the triangle had their own stories. Compasses that reversed direction mid-flight, radio interference that lasted for miles, inexplicable engine failures. Days turned to weeks, and still no sign of Sam. The mining camp never received their supplies. Search efforts continued until the first major snowstorm of the season buried the region under white silence. Officially, the case was closed after 2 months. Unofficially, no one who'd been part of the search could shake the feeling that something far stranger had happened. One of the helicopter pilots later admitted in an interview that he'd experienced intense nausea and vertigo while flying over a particular stretch of valley, a sensation he couldn't explain. His compass spun wildly, and his co-pilots swore they were seeing duplicate images of the landscape, like reflections of mountains that weren't really there. Emily stayed in Anchorage long after the search ended. Every day she'd go to the small hangar where Sam had kept his plane and sit in silence. She replayed his last radio transmission over and over in her head. The way his voice broke just slightly before the static. The word approaching what? She couldn't stop thinking about it. In her gut, she felt he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. She began to gather every missing flight report she could find, comparing routes and conditions. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. The majority of disappearances occurred within a rough triangular boundary, and many of them followed eerily similar circumstances. Clear skies, normal communication, sudden radio silence, and no wreckage. One night, while studying maps spread across her motel table, Emily noticed something strange. When she connected the points of the disappearances by hand, they clustered tightly around a particular mountain range north of the Tanana Valley, an area long avoided by locals. In small faded handwriting on one of the older maps, she saw a note scribbled by a previous surveyor. Magnetic irregularities. Avoid prolonged exposure. It was then she realized this wasn't just an isolated mystery. Something in that land, something ancient, unseen, and unexplainable, was claiming lives. In the years that followed, people would continue to vanish inside that same triangle. Some blamed sudden weather shifts. Others suggested geological faults or strong electromagnetic fields. But none of those explanations accounted for the lack of debris, the absence of any physical trace. Sam Keller's name became another statistic in Alaska's long list of missing souls. But to Emily, it was personal. It was a wound that never healed, a question that refused to die. Locals would sometimes mention her brother's disappearance in hushed tones, as if speaking of it too loudly might invite the same fate. Pilots who flew through the region claimed to see flickers of light in the distance, or faint radio transmissions echoing words from nowhere. Years later, when new disappearances occurred under similar conditions, people remembered Sam Keller, the pilot who vanished on a clear blue morning and was never seen again. Some say, on quiet nights, if you listen to old radio frequencies in Anchorage, you can still catch fragments of his voice through the static, repeating that final phrase, approaching Tanana Valley, like a ghost forever lost in the airwaves. And maybe somewhere deep in that cold, indifferent wilderness beneath the snow and the silence, something is still waiting, patient, invisible, and hungry. 2 years had passed since Sam Keller's plane disappeared, and yet for his sister Emily, time had not moved at all. Every morning she woke with the same thought, that maybe today she'd find the clue everyone else had missed. She had tried to return to her normal life in Seattle, but nothing felt right. The world had dulled, as if color itself had faded the day Sam vanished. He had been her only family left, her anchor since their parents died. Losing him to a mystery that made no sense was something she couldn't accept. So one cold February morning, Emily packed her car and drove north, crossing into Alaska with a single purpose: to find out what really happened to her brother. Anchorage was as she remembered it: wide skies, frozen breath, and the sound of wind whispering through everything. The people she met were kind, but distant. When she told them why she was there, their expressions changed. The mention of the Alaska Triangle always made people uneasy, like she had spoken something best left buried. At a small diner near Merrill Field Airport, a waitress named Nora leaned close and whispered that she should stop asking questions. "People go missing out there," she said, her voice low. "Not just your brother. Whole planes, hunters, scientists. The mountain keeps them." Emily smiled politely, but her heart tightened. She didn't believe in curses. She believed in facts. She began her search at the Alaska Aviation Archives, a dusty building filled with yellowed flight logs and cold coffee cups. The clerk, an older man named Harris, helped her dig through records of missing aircraft. What she found unsettled her. Dozens of flights, all vanished within the same rough boundary between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow. The files stretched back decades, far before her brother was even born. The reports were eerily similar: radio contact lost without distress signal, last known coordinates within the same mountainous corridor, and zero wreckage found. Some were logged as weather-related, others as equipment failure, but too many shared clear skies and calm conditions. As she copied the files, Harris said quietly, "You're not the first to come looking. Journalists, families, even military folks have asked the same questions. They all leave the same way, empty-handed." Emily nodded, but said nothing. She could feel his warning, the weight of hopelessness that came with this place. But she wasn't going to leave. Her next step was to speak with locals. She visited bars where pilots gathered after long flights, remote townships where people still lived by lantern light, and weather stations perched on cliffs overlooking valleys of ice. The more she asked, the more she heard the same two things: fear and superstition. Some pilots refused to fly over certain regions, claiming their instruments went haywire, compasses spinning wildly, and radios picking up ghost transmissions. Others swore they'd seen orbs of light floating above the forests at night, moving intelligently, vanishing the moment someone looked directly at them. In Fairbanks, Emily met a retired Air Force officer named Robert Haynes, who agreed to talk on the condition that she didn't record him. They met in a small cafe where he sat with his back to the wall, eyes always scanning the room. His voice was rough from years of cold air and cigarettes. "I was stationed at Elmendorf in the 70s, he said. "Back then we saw things, blips on radar that didn't make sense. Planes that weren't there, or signals from ones that disappeared years before." He paused and leaned closer. "Sometimes they came back. Same tail numbers, same transponders, just echoing through the airwaves. It was like the sky itself had a memory." Emily's skin prickled. "You're saying you picked up signals from lost planes?" "I'm saying the triangle doesn't work by our rules," he replied. "It's not just bad weather or magnetic storms, it's something deeper. You can feel it in your bones when you're flying through it, like the air is alive watching you." She wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but there was a strange sincerity in his eyes. When she asked if he'd ever seen anything himself, he hesitated, then said, "Once. A flash, like lightning without thunder. The plane ahead of us vanished from radar. No wreckage ever found. But we all saw it. Just gone." That night, Emily returned to her cabin outside Anchorage and listened to the wind scrape against the windows. The stories haunted her, but so did the data. She spread maps across the table, marking every known disappearance. When she drew lines between them, a pattern began to emerge. A distorted triangle, sharp and precise. It was no coincidence. Her brother's last known coordinates sat near the center. She ran her fingers over the lines, wondering what could possibly connect these vanishings. Electromagnetic anomalies, rogue weather patterns, military experiments. She entertained them all, but none fit perfectly. The next morning, she decided to visit the Tanana Valley, the last place her brother's plane had made contact. The drive was long and punishing. The roads narrowed until they became little more than icy trails winding through endless forests. Every so often she'd see the remains of an old crash, a rusted fuselage half buried in snow, but never her brother's plane. Locals in the small settlements along the way warned her not to go deeper. A trapper named James told her he'd heard voices echoing through the trees one night, calling his name in the voice of his dead wife. "That valley ain't right," he said. "Sometimes it gives you what you lost. Other times, it takes more." Emily smiled politely again, but the story clung to her. The rational part of her mind fought against the unease growing inside her. But as night fell, and the stars pressed down like ice, she began to feel something she couldn't explain. The silence was too perfect, the cold too heavy. It was as if the land itself was aware of her presence. When she returned to Anchorage, she decided to check the last official search coordinates. The small airport's records officer pulled out the old file, and as she flipped through the pages, she noticed a set of handwritten notes in the margin. Possible radar echo detected. Coordinates inconsistent. She traced them on a fresh map and froze. The coordinates didn't match the known flight path. They were 40 miles north, in a region no one had searched. That night, her GPS, which had been turned off, suddenly flickered to life. The device beeped and numbers appeared on the screen, the exact same coordinates she had just written down. For a moment she stared in disbelief. Then the device powered off again. She replaced the batteries, but it wouldn't turn back on. Sleep was impossible. She sat by the window, staring at the dark horizon, the northern lights moving faintly above the mountains. Somewhere out there, in that frozen emptiness, was the answer. She could feel it, pulling at her like gravity. In the following days, Emily met with a few private pilots, asking if anyone would take her near those coordinates. Most laughed, some refused outright, and one man simply crossed himself and walked away. Finally, she found Joe Larkin, a rugged pilot in his 40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for flying routes no one else would. "You're not the first person to chase ghosts out there," he told her. "But if you're paying, I'll fly." As they prepared for the flight, Emily felt a mix of fear and hope. The coordinates, the lights, the strange reports, all of it was leading her somewhere. She didn't believe in legends or monsters, but she believed in her brother. She believed that somewhere out there was an explanation. Maybe a hidden valley, maybe a secret crash site, maybe even a truth the government didn't want people to know. That night, as she packed her camera and notebooks, she felt the faintest vibration under the cabin floor. A low, distant hum, like an engine far away. It faded as quickly as it came. She told herself it was just wind or a passing plane. But as she turned off the light and lay in bed, she thought she heard something else. A faint, broken voice carried on the wind, whispering her brother's last words. Approaching Tanana Valley. And somewhere deep in the dark, beyond the reach of light or logic, something seemed to whisper back. The morning of the flight was unnervingly calm. A pale pink light spread across the Alaskan sky as Emily Keller stood beside the small twin-prop plane Joe Larkin had prepared. The air bit at her skin, sharp and cold enough to make every breath feel like glass. The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched and indifferent. She watched Joe move methodically, checking the fuel lines, testing the flaps, his motion steady and practiced. He was a man used to danger, but even he looked uneasy that morning. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked as he zipped his flight jacket. "People don't go poking around that part of the triangle, not unless they're looking to join the missing." Emily forced a thin smile. "I'm not looking to join them. I'm looking to find one." He didn't argue after that. Once the plane's engines roared to life, the sound shattered the silence of the empty airfield. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, strapping in as Joe guided the aircraft down the frozen runway. The moment they lifted off, the city disappeared behind them, replaced by an ocean of white wilderness that seemed to stretch beyond the world itself. The sun glimmered faintly on the snow, and for a time it was almost peaceful. At first, the flight went smoothly. The altimeter held steady, the compass pointed true north, and the radio connection with Anchorage remained strong. Emily stared down through the window at the vast emptiness below. Endless forests, frozen rivers winding like veins of silver, mountains casting long blue shadows across the land. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "You see that?" Joe said, nodding toward the horizon. "That's Tanana Valley, where your brother vanished. Weather's too perfect today. It's almost wrong." Emily didn't answer. She clutched the small locket around her neck. Sam's, the one he'd left behind before his last flight. As they entered the valley airspace, the instruments began to flicker. The altimeter needle trembled. The compass spun half a rotation before settling. Joe frowned and tapped the dials. "That's weird. Shouldn't be any interference out here." Then came the static. At first it was faint, just a whisper in the headset, like distant radio chatter. Emily leaned forward. "Is that Anchorage?" she asked. Joe adjusted the frequency, but the sound didn't clear. The static thickened, shifting between soft hisses and faint words that almost formed sentences. It wasn't random noise. It was a voice. A man's voice, distorted but unmistakable, cutting through the static for only a second before vanishing. Emily froze. She had heard those words before. Approaching Tanana Valley. It was Sam's voice. Joe turned to her, eyes wide. "What was that?" She didn't answer. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Before she could speak, the radio went completely silent, and every gauge on the control panel blinked off. The plane continued to glide, but the hum of the engines deepened, vibrating through the cabin as if the air itself had grown heavier. Joe muttered something under his breath and began trying to reset the systems. "We're losing power. It's like flying through molasses." Outside, the light began to change. The bright blue of morning dimmed into a cold gray, though there were no clouds above them. The mountains ahead shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt, bending and twisting at the edges. Emily pressed her face against the glass. What she saw made her stomach drop. The landscape below was wrong. Rivers flowing where maps showed none. Ridges where there should have been valleys, and shadows that didn't match the direction of the light. It was as though they were flying over a reflection of Alaska, an imitation made of shifting glass. Then came the light. At first it appeared as a faint glow far ahead, hovering above the valley floor like a floating orb. It pulsed rhythmically, once, twice, 3 times, and each time brighter, larger. Joe swore under his breath and grabbed the controls, trying to turn away, but the plane resisted as if caught in a current. The instruments were dead now. The compass spun endlessly, the GPS blank. Emily felt pressure in her ears, the same feeling she'd get in a deep dive underwater. Her vision blurred at the edges, and every hair on her arm stood upright. The glow expanded rapidly, filling the sky in front of them until the cockpit was bathed in a white-gold radiance. The hum grew louder, turning into a deep vibration that resonated through their bones. Emily's teeth rattled. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Joe shouted something. She couldn't hear the words and yanked the yoke back, but the plane didn't respond. It was as if gravity itself had shifted. Everything went weightless for a moment, the world dissolving into light and sound. For a few seconds, or maybe a lifetime, there was nothing but brilliance. No sound, no movement, no sense of up or down. Emily floated in a void of colorless brightness, the hum replaced by a single steady tone that seemed to come from everywhere. She felt warmth and cold at the same time, her body suspended in a place that defied logic. When her vision finally began to return, she saw shapes moving within the light. Tall, human-like figures, transparent and fluid, like silhouettes made of water. They didn't move so much as shimmer, as if shifting between realities. One of them turned toward her. She couldn't see a face, but she felt something. Recognition, almost familiarity. Then it reached out a hand. Emily gasped, jerking backward, and the light shattered like glass. The sound returned all at once, the roar of the engines, the screaming wind, Joe yelling her name. She blinked and realized the glow had vanished. The sky was clear again, but the landscape had changed completely. Mountains that should have been ahead were gone. Rivers had moved. The sun was in the wrong position. Joe's hands shook as he tried to steady the plane. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. Before she could answer, the engine sputtered. The plane dropped sharply, sending both of them lurching forward. Joe fought the controls, managing to pull out of the dive. But the altitude warning alarm blared in the cabin. "We're too low," he yelled. Then suddenly everything stopped again. The plane leveled itself, as if an invisible force had caught it mid-air. The hum returned, low and resonant. Emily felt her heartbeat slow against her will, her body going numb. She reached for Joe's arm, but her fingers passed right through it, like he was dissolving into air. She screamed, but the sound didn't leave her mouth. The world dimmed. The last thing she saw was a flash of blinding white, and Joe's terrified eyes staring at something behind her. When the search team found Joe's plane 3 days later, it was resting upright in a snowfield nearly 200 miles off course. The fuel tanks were half full, the propellers undamaged, and the fuselage intact. But there were no footprints, no signs of a crash landing, and no trace of either Emily Keller or Joe Larkin. Investigators were baffled. The interior showed no signs of struggle. Everything was in perfect condition, except for the camera wedged beneath the passenger seat. When they developed the film, the final photograph chilled everyone who saw it. It showed Emily in the cockpit, eyes wide, her face lit by a strange glow. Behind her, reflected in the glass, was a figure, tall, human-shaped, but translucent, like it was made of mist and light. The expression on her face was pure terror. Officials filed the case under aviation anomaly, but among those who had searched the wreckage, whispers began to spread. Some claimed that the photo was altered, others that it had been confiscated soon after by government agents. One search officer later admitted, years later in a private interview, that before they airlifted the plane out, every compass in the area began to spin uncontrollably, and for a brief moment their radios came alive with static. Through it, they heard a faint voice, a woman's voice, repeating a single line over and over, distorted but unmistakable. "It's not lost. It's waiting." The official report on Emily Keller's disappearance was brief and unsatisfying. Aircraft located. Passengers missing. Probable disorientation and crash. That was it. 3 short lines to explain something that no one could explain. The authorities didn't want to discuss the strange condition of the plane, the missing time, or the eerie photograph. To them, it was another accident in a place that had swallowed thousands. But those who'd been there, those who had felt the strange stillness of that valley, knew better. There was no crash. There was something else at work in that corner of Alaska. Something vast and unseen that defied every attempt to understand it. A few months after the investigation closed, the story began to spread. Journalists picked up fragments of it. A missing journalist, a found plane, a mysterious photograph. Most dismissed it as conspiracy nonsense. Another tale to feed the growing legend of the Alaska Triangle. But not everyone was willing to let it go. A team of researchers from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, led by Dr. Warren Huxley, requested permission to conduct a geological and magnetic survey of the area where the plane had been found. The government reluctantly approved the mission, but with clear instructions: minimal media involvement, no speculation, and no deviation from scientific procedure. When the team arrived at the Tanana Valley in the spring of 2001, the air was unnervingly still. They set up base near the coordinates where Joe's plane had been recovered. The first few days were uneventful. They collected rock samples, measured soil magnetism, and charted the terrain. But soon strange readings began to appear. Compasses refused to settle. GPS units showed locations hundreds of miles away from their true position. Their satellite phones crackled with bursts of static that seemed to contain fragments of voices. Soft, disjointed, whispering. One night while reviewing their data, Dr. Huxley noticed something disturbing. Every few hours the sensors registered a low-frequency vibration beneath the ground, rhythmic like a heartbeat. At first they assumed it was geological activity, perhaps underground ice shifting or small tremors. But the pattern was too precise, too regular. It pulsed at exact intervals, continuing day and night. The team began to feel uneasy. Several members complained of headaches, dizziness, and an odd sensation of being watched. One technician swore he saw a figure standing on a ridge at dusk, motionless and translucent before it faded into thin air. By the fifth day, 2 researchers refused to stay overnight and drove back toward Anchorage, terrified. Dr. Huxley pressed on, determined to find a rational explanation. Late one night, while reviewing the data alone in his tent, he heard something outside. Faint, deliberate footsteps circling the camp. He called out, assuming it was one of his colleagues, but there was no response. The steps stopped directly behind his tent, and a cold draft seeped through the fabric. Then came the whisper, soft and close, right at his ear. "Not yours to find." His flashlight flickered out. By morning, Huxley was gone. His tent was zipped from the inside, and his equipment was untouched. The remaining team members packed up immediately and left the valley without looking back. The university quietly shut down the research program, and the official statement listed environmental stress and exposure as the probable cause of Huxley's disappearance. But within the small circle of Alaskan pilots and rescue workers, the whispers began again. They said the valley had taken another one. Over the next few years, satellite imagery of the region became increasingly unreliable. Entire stretches of terrain appeared blurred or distorted, as though the land itself refused to be photographed. Weather satellites recorded electromagnetic surges directly over the Tanana Valley, short bursts that disrupted signals and briefly blacked out nearby communication towers. Each time the readings lasted less than a minute. Just long enough to register, never long enough to trace. In 2008, a park ranger named Michael Dawes claimed to have stumbled upon something unusual while patrolling a frozen river near that same area. Beneath a thin sheet of ice, he spotted what looked like metal. He returned a week later with a small excavation crew, and together they unearthed part of a plane's tail section, perfectly preserved in the permafrost. The serial number matched Sam Keller's Piper Navajo, the one that had disappeared 10 years earlier. Inside, they found a cockpit remarkably intact, seats still bolted down, controls frozen in place. But something was wrong. The interior looked newer than it should have, as though it hadn't spent a decade buried in ice. The instruments gleamed. The paint wasn't corroded. It was as if time hadn't touched it. When Dawes examined the logbook found inside, his hands began to shake. The entries stopped the day Sam vanished, but then continued 2 years later in handwriting identical to Emily's. The last entry read, "Not lost. It's waiting." After that discovery, Dawes vanished too. His colleagues found his snowmobile parked neatly at the site, engine still warm but no footprints leading away from it. Just an expanse of untouched snow. The logbook was sent to a state lab for analysis, but the report was sealed within weeks and the artifact was never displayed. A rumor circulated that a military transport helicopter arrived quietly one night and removed the remains of the plane. No one ever confirmed it, but by then confirmation didn't matter. People began to speak of the Alaska Triangle with renewed fear. The disappearances never stopped. They only changed shape. Hikers vanished without trace. Entire expeditions lost contact within minutes of entering the region. Satellites malfunctioned. Pilots flying near the perimeter reported momentary losses of time. Watches that stopped for exactly 10 minutes, then resumed as if nothing had happened. A few even claimed to hear voices over their radios. Fragments of words that matched old transmission logs from flights lost decades ago. Despite all of it, some people still went looking. Curiosity is its own curse. They wanted to understand what drew people in. A scientific anomaly, an energy field, a tear between worlds. No one agreed on the explanation, but everyone agreed on one thing. Once the triangle noticed you, it didn't forget. To this day, the Tanana Valley remains off limits to casual exploration. The official reason is safety, unpredictable weather, wildlife, and unstable ground. But locals know the truth runs deeper. They avoid that land, even those who don't believe in ghosts or myths. On quiet nights, pilots claim they can still pick up faint radio chatter on long-abandoned frequencies. Sometimes it's static. Sometimes it's a voice. Occasionally that voice says, "Approaching Tanana Valley." And then there are the lights. Strange orbs that drift silently over the mountains, blue and white, pulsing like breath. Those who have seen them up close say they move with purpose, as if watching. Sometimes they flicker just long enough for a camera to catch a faint outline. Not of machinery, but of human figures walking through the air. No one has ever proven what the Alaska Triangle truly is. Some say it's a magnetic vortex or a geological anomaly that distorts time and space. Others insist it's a place where reality wears thin, where people slip between worlds without realizing it. The Tlingit elders simply say the land is alive and it remembers. The last known photograph connected to the Keller case surfaced in 2019, anonymously mailed to a local newspaper. It showed the same snow-covered ridge near Tanana Valley. In the distance, barely visible, was a figure standing at the edge of a frozen lake. A woman with short dark hair, wearing a red parka. She was staring upward at a faint circular light hovering above her. The photo was dated that same year, but experts confirmed the model of the parka hadn't been manufactured since 1999. To this day, no one knows who took that picture or how it was delivered. But for those who've studied the triangle, it was enough to reignite the legend. Some believe it was Emily, some believe it was something else wearing her face. Either way, the message is the same. The Alaska Triangle doesn't lose people. It keeps them, it waits, it remembers. And sometimes, if you stand too close, it looks back.